All right, human geography students, we are going to move on to notes section 2.3, so you should label this 2.3. All right, let my computer catch up. Okay, so population and natural hazards, we're going to be looking at some of the connections between checks on population and diseases and natural hazards and that sort of thing that Malthus had predicted would place natural checks on population. Okay, so population fluctuations can occur because of the natural environment. Historically, a favorable and good climate will result in sufficient food supply, and that results in population increases. Population decreases occurred across Eurasia during the Little Ice Age of the 17th century, so that would be the 1600s. We also saw population decreases at other times throughout history during the Middle Ages, during the Little Ice Age of the Middle Ages, which include time of famine and also the spread of the Black Plague. Humans have adapted their lifestyles to fit climate conditions. So, some obvious examples are if you live in a colder climate, you tend to build warmer housing and develop better methods of heating spaces. Environmental disasters cause negative impacts on population levels. So environmental disasters would include drought, hurricanes, typhoons, and tsunamis. All right, let me go back for just a second. So hurricanes and typhoons are essentially the same thing. Hurricanes are storms that originate out of the Atlantic Ocean moving towards North America, and typhoons are typically originate in the Pacific Ocean moving towards Asia. So two of Malthus's negative checks, famine and disease, have often resulted from natural hazards that impact food production. In modern times, human endeavors have lessened these negative checks through better health care and more control over food production. So think of like the FDA and how they monitor beef production or how they monitor agriculture. Many diseases have been eradicated over time or controlled in modern times through the use of vaccines and antibiotics. And food distribution, however, is still a problem in some parts of the world due to famine. However, most countries have access to nutritious foods. Food distribution can also be interrupted by problems with infrastructure. So, for example, food might be donated by relief organizations to a country suffering from famine. However, if the infrastructure doesn't support getting that food to the population in need, then famine can continue. With more contact among peoples of the earth, the potential for rapid spread of communicable diseases has grown, and a widespread epidemic is called a pandemic. So some examples of widespread diseases that you should know about and potentially might show up on the AP exam, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just a few of the examples. So AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, a disease that began in Central Africa during the late 20th century and spread to many countries by the end of the century. Asian bird flu, a deadly virus concentrated in China and Southeast Asia. It spread from birds to humans. Potential to be a major outbreak if it's not contained to localities. So contained to localities means that they stop the spread from diffusing to other areas. Swine flu, H1N1, began in Mexico in 2009 and then spread to other countries. There was a panic in the United States over the H1N1 flu, and there was a shortage of vaccines, and so a lot of people experienced a lot of fear and panic over the H1N1 flu. So we're also going to look at population policies because there are natural checks on population, but governments and supranational organizations can put policies in place to check population. So, some population policies over the past century, many countries seek to influence the overall growth rate of their populations. Most governments today seek to reduce the rate of natural increase through restrictive population policies that range from tolerations of officially banned means of birth control, actual prohibition of large families, so think of the China one-child policy. So in your notes, I want you to make note of the fact that these are also known as anti-natalist policies. So restrictive population policies are also known as anti-natalist policies. Anti means against, and natal means birth. So anti-natalist policies. So some international policy efforts since the 1990s, the United Nations and other international organizations have taken an interest in controlling population growth on a global scale. For the first time, population policy was officially tied to women's empowerment, especially when it came to the number of children that they have. So women who have access to jobs and education are much more likely to have fewer children because fewer children allows them to pursue opportunities outside the home. So this is a quote from the United Nations Population Information Network. Improving the status of women also enhances their decision-making capacity at all levels in all spheres of life, especially in the area of sexuality and reproduction. This in turn is essential for the long-term success of population programs. Experiences show that population and development programs are most effective when steps have simultaneously been taken to improve the status of women. In 1994, the International Conference on Population was held. It was held in Cairo. Recommended that national governments pass laws that allow women to combine family roles with participation in the workforce because they saw a positive relationship between women in the workforce and population control. In 1995, we had the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing, China. Included women from less developed countries, affirmed the importance of women's ability to control their own fertility, so have a voice in how many children they have. Education and employment opportunities, again, were emphasized as being positive influences on population control. So for the purposes of the AP test and for the unit test, you've got to be familiar with population policies of China and India. As you know from reading your textbook, both China and India have enormous populations, being the two most populous countries in the world. Okay, so national population policies, they're the two most populous countries in the world. Each has taken a very different approach to population growth. Contrasting policies have resulted in different population patterns and problems, as well as predictions for the future. All right, so we're going to take a look at China first. So under the Chinese leader Mao Zedong, in 1965, Mao Zedong believed that the overexpanding Chinese population was a good thing. By 1974, he's denouncing population policies as imperialist tools designed to weaken developing countries. So he sees that that population growth is a good thing for China. It means that there's going to be lots of workers in China doing good things for China. In 1976, at the time of Mao's death, China's population was approximately 850 million people with a birth rate of 25, so a crude birth rate of 25. Successors of Mao Zedong, so people who took his place, the leaders that came into power after Mao Zedong passed away, recognized that population growth was consuming 1/2 of the annual increase in China's gross domestic product, or GDP. And so they realized they had to put a check on population. And so they introduced a campaign advocating the two-child only. So this is not an official policy yet. It's just an advertising campaign and encouragement to limit family sizes to 2 children. Government provided services, including abortions, supported the program. And the result was that the birth rate dropped to 9.5 by the late 1970s. So remember, the crude birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 people in the country. So in 1976, the crude birth rate was 25. By the late 1970s, the crude birth rate had dropped to 9.5. In 1975, Deng Xiaoping became the new leader of China, and he instituted the now famous one-child policy. It included both incentives and penalties to assure that couples would have only one child. So incentives are kind of like rewards, and of course penalties are punishment. So it's a carrot and stick sort of mentality. To families that followed the policy, late marriages were encouraged. Free contraceptives were provided. Abortions were provided. Free sterilizations were also provided. Families that did not follow the policy received very steep fines. In 1984, the policy relaxed in rural or countryside areas where children's labor was still important. So family farms were still running and operating on family labor, and so having more children was needed. In 2002, the policy was reinstated in rural areas. Many rural births had not been reported to the government, so their population count was inaccurate. In Chinese cities, people were generally more accepting of the one-child policy since it suited urban living. Cities can be overcrowded, they can be very packed, and fewer children makes it easier to live in smaller spaces. In 1986, the birth rate had fallen to 18, much less than other developing countries. But there were some unintended consequences of the policy. There was a rise in female infanticide, or the killing of baby girls, since male children were preferred in Chinese society. And so they ended up with a lopsided population pyramid, and so they had a lopsided number of young adult males to young adult females, which maybe might not be a huge problem until you start thinking about China maintaining its population, because what this means, if you've got too many males and not enough females, you're going to have not enough women to go around and not as many Chinese marriages. So young men essentially are unable to find women to marry in modern day China. So the projection is that China's population numbers will start falling by mid-21st century. So right around 2050, we expect their population numbers to decline. If change occurs, there will be too few sons to carry on the tradition of taking care of elderly parents. So in Chinese society, it is expected that children will take care of their parents. If these young men are unable to marry and unable to have children of their own, it means that they will not have anyone to take care of them when they are elderly. So this presents China with a problem. What will China do to take care of its elderly citizens in the future? India also faces population struggles. Unlike China, India has difficulty coordinating a centralized population policy. India is a culturally and politically diverse federation of 28 states and 7 union territories. So instead of being under a strong central government like China, you have a lot of regional governments that come in with their own policies and muddy the waters. The national government is unable, under its current constitution, to force its will on the states and territories with various problems and policies. So population growth characterizes the entire country, but population pressures are greater in Assam, Nagaland, and Mizoram. The 1950s, population planning began. In the 1950s, this is not long after India gains its independence. Limited funds for family planning clinics and programs are provided in the 1950s. But it does little to stop the population growth. In the 1960s, there's a national program, and the states are encouraged to join the national program. But rapid population growth continues. Today, Indian state governments use advertising to encourage families to have fewer children. There's a network of clinics established to aid women in small villages. In India, despite coordination problems, India's birth rate has dropped more than half in 35 years. Most demographers predict that before 2050, India will surpass China and will become the most populous country in the world. And this is partially because India does not have the resources and the collaboration necessary to curtail population growth. All right, so key questions to consider from this session. You should be able to answer the question, why do populations fluctuate? Think about natural reasons and government policy reasons. How do natural hazards impact population? So not only do they cause death and destruction, but they also cause impact on a society's ability to create and maintain agriculture. How do people adjust to their environments and climate? So think again about the example of people living in a colder climate who build warmer housing. What role has globalization played in the spread of disease? So here you want to think about pandemic diseases. What international efforts have been made to curtail population growth? What is the population policy of China? What is the population policy of India? And what has been the impact of population policies on India and China? So again, China is facing a lopsided population pyramid, and India is being faced with being the projection of being the most populous country in 2050.